Welcome to the Insight Myanmar podcast. Before we get into today's show, I wanted to let you know that we have a lot more written and video content on our website. If you haven't visited it yet, we invite you to take a look at www.insightmyanmar.org. In addition to complete information about all of our past episodes, there's also a variety of blogs, books, and videos to check out, and you can also sign up for our regular newsletter. But for now, enjoy what follows, and remember, sharing is caring. For this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, we're with Dave Mathieson, and we'll be exploring his longtime advocacy, activism, scholarship of human rights, and many other things in Burma. So we'd like to welcome you to taking the time to chat with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, so I'd like to begin by looking at where your trajectory first intersected with Burma. Where did it first get on the map for you?
I studied international relations at university, specializing especially in Asian studies. And in the early 90s, it always struck me that Burma, Myanmar was just never taught. No one ever really mentioned it. And, you know, there was a lot of classes on East Asia and Southeast Asia, and lots of people talking about the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I started reading a lot of the Far Eastern Economic Review and coming across the works of Bertil Lintner. And then I saw the cover of Martin Smith's book, Burma Insurgency and the Politics of Ethnicity, with those Karen soldiers and up on the elephant. And I was hooked, and I read the book. I was absolutely thoroughly confused because the book is brilliant, but it's also very detailed and dense. You know, Martin and Bertil in Burma and Revolt both did, I think, a brilliant job of taking that complexity. And so, you know, from that I just started reading a lot, and I had somehow missed the '88 uprising, and which had been overshadowed a year later by Tiananmen Square and the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course. And reading more and more about it, especially through Bertil's coverage in the Far Eastern Economic Review, and just finding out this absolutely fascinating history of the country. And I've always been quite obsessive about World War II history, and started reading about the experiences in Burma during the Second World War. But what really gripped me was the contemporary insurgency and how complicated it was, and how very few people really talked about it. And of course, like a lot of people of that generation, I was quite mesmerized by Aung San Suu Kyi and her defiance against this thugocracy. And so then decided to do an MPhil. You know, when I graduated from the honours year, I didn't want to jump straight into a PhD because I just thought I was too ignorant and inexperienced to do something like that. So I did an MPhil in South Australia, and I saw that as an extended period of trying to educate myself about Burma. And went to the country for the first time in 1996 on kind of field work, I guess, but it was really just a visit, and I travelled to lots of different places. And then came to Thailand soon after that, and just really wanted to go back to Burma. So I did. I went back, actually met Aung San Suu Kyi for an hour and a half or so, and then went back to Australia and, you know, toiled away at from a very, you know, from a distance, trying to follow complicated events. But it coincided, I think, with, you know, the internet kind of opening up, and there was a lot of innovation in terms of international activism BurmaNet and all of these news groups, and there was small but quite intensive interest in Australia, and some of the scholars like Andrew Self were based in Australia, and the Australian National University started hosting the annual Burma updates, and so that's when I first met Professor David Steinberg and my late professor Desmond Ball, who I worked with for many years. Also met Christina Fink and Mary Callahan and all of these great kind of international scholars of Myanmar. So yeah, it was really that kind of, I kind of just took my time trying to understand a very complicated place usually from afar, and tried to read everything I possibly could at the time. And one thing I would reflect on, over the past 30 years is there's just so much more fantastic stuff to read now. I think the quality of scholarship, especially Myanmar scholars, and the media and civil society and think tanks, the quality of stuff coming out now just didn't exist 30 years ago.
Yeah,
there was some really good stuff. I'm not diminishing that at all. But you look at just how rich and complicated and accomplished a lot of stuff is now. It's really, there really is, I think, an amazing community of not just scholars, but kind of intersectional scholars, people who work in the media and activism fields and many others. So I think that's the one thing that I would say over the past 30 years has really been quite a dramatic positive change.
That's great. So when you were starting out in trying to, and being hooked and trying to understand this more, reading, talking to people, if you put yourself back at that time, could you describe or remember what were some of like the burning questions you have? What was the quest for like, I just don't get how these things fit together, or what's going on with this part of it? What was really driving some of that early interest?
That a regime like the State Law and Order Restoration Council could just hold on and being so unpopular. And it's always been an obsession with very few adequate answers of why such a regime and a military mentality of impoverishing a whole country and making everyone live in fear is their approach to statecraft. That why would they have to do it that way? And so to me, it's always been the character of the military that I've never really understood, and why this. I mean, the level of cruelty, the level of mismanagement, the level of self-defeatism, the fact that they do things that are against their own self-interest, or what we would consider rational. It's not just a Western rationality. I asked Burmese friends, why do they act that way? And it's like, I have no idea.
Can you give an example of some of those things that are acting against their own interests?
The coup in 2021. Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was quite a common observation in the weeks leading up to the coup d'etat that people were like, they won't stage a coup because it's against their interests. And I remember talking to people after the coup, and I was like, hold on, that still holds true. The coup was against their own interests, but they did it anyway. And we have to try and understand why. And at various points over the last 3 years, they've had times, I think, where they could have kind of diverted or done something to have taken the sting out of it. But instead, it's like, no, we're going to murder our way out of this. It makes absolutely no sense.
So this was one of the initial guiding questions you had delving into the interests of Myanmar. You've been at this question for decades. You've spoken to hundreds, if not thousands of people. You've read hundreds, if not thousands of articles and books. Have you made any headway on trying to answer this basic question?
I think there's a lot of incredibly complicated and contradictory elements to it, but I think fundamentally it comes down to bloody-mindedness and an arrogant sense of entitlement that we own this place and we're not sharing it with anyone else. I think that there really is that corporate mentality that you can read the propaganda, you can try and understand the compulsion. It's not just greed, it's not just Praetorian entitlement, it's something deeper. It's like, no, this is our place, we own it. And if we can't have it, then no one else can. And there's a Burmese expression that a friend taught me a couple of years ago that basically means throwing sand on the beef. And I had to get him to explain that to me. And he said, look, Min Aung Hlaing, basically, he would throw sand on the beef if he had to share it or if you were going to get it all. and that's the way he sees things. And when you see their behaviour in places like Sisang and Poktor, when they're driven out of a place by the Brotherhood Alliance up in Shan State and by the Arakan army in Rakhine, and then they just flatten the whole town, they destroy the market, and it's still got that mentality. And I've seen the military do that as an institution for many years. And several years ago I was reflecting on this, and it was actually something that I heard from Christopher Hitchens that I think applies probably even more in Myanmar to the Myanmar military, which is a culture of recreational sadism. And I got in trouble. Some people during the so-called transition, people in Yangon were like, why do you keep saying things like that? The military is changing. And I'm like, no, they're not. Like, they're changing the way they talk to you, to elites in Naypyidaw, but they're not changing on the ground. And if you've spent as much time speaking to survivors of military violence, you'll notice that they torture and kill basically for sport. There's no logic behind it other than we can get away with this. And I think that cruelty is really at the heart of the military as an institution, this blend of entitlement, that we own this place and we can be as cruel as we want, and you must capitulate. You have to kneel down. And in lots of other conflict settings, it's like, winning hearts and minds is just a necessary part of this. And to me, the Myanmar military has never been interested in classical counterinsurgency or state building. It's like, you will capitulate and we will just keep going until you surrender. So yeah, I think that's an imperfect conclusion that I've come to, but I still think I still think as an institution there's still so much work that needs to be done, primarily by Myanmar scholars. I think it has to be a national project. And that international scholars, and there's been some great stuff by Japanese scholars on the Nakanishi's book, I think is brilliant, as well as Mary Callahan and Andrew Self's stuff, and Mong Ongmyo, a Myanmar scholar as well. But I think that moving forward there needs to be this memorization of the military as an institution of governance, as an institution of coercion, of the economy. And a big part of that's got to be, why were they as brutal as they have been consistently for 7 decades? And I do think that's quite an urgent project, and something that was almost completely ignored over that decade of the transition. I think that there was way too much optimism about how they were changing and not about what their internal culture really was.
When people try to understand the military, and certainly when they look at the historical background, one of the things, the rationales that's often brought up, sometimes it can be more of an apologist bent, and sometimes, which is more insidious, and sometimes it could be more of a genuine understanding, just a genuine attempt just to understand how do they look at the world, how do they think of the world, and that's this idea of they are the strong man, that's the only one capable of bringing people together in even if it's imperfect, a sense of national unity. It would all fall apart and disintegrate without them. They're going about it sometimes a clumsy, wrong way, but this is at least some rationale explaining what they're doing from their side. And so, and I hear that, and then I also hear what you said of, and see countless examples of them behaving like a terrorist organization, a mafia organization that just happens to be in charge of an entire country and is doing nothing but exploitation and illicit trade and trading different domains and industries within each other. And so sometimes I wonder, to what extent was there perhaps a transition from one intent to another? To what extent are these two things balanced? How do you reconcile the explanation or the rationale that they're, whether they're effective or not, whether they're clumsy, brutal or not, the fact that they're at least trying, that they at least have a sense of themselves as being a protector of the nation, that somewhere in their minds they hold that this is an entitlement or authority they have, versus or balanced with this sense of just pure exploitation, terror, brutal violence at every turn.
I think that really gets to the heart of it, that they believe their own myths. And their myths are that, without us, the country will disintegrate. And we're the indispensable institution. And don't necessarily think that, one way to kind of approach state building is to build other strong institutions of courts, of justice, of education, of administration, and yet they've purposely weakened most arms of the state. And as Mary Callahan, I think, very astutely noticed years ago, making enemies was really their approach to state building. And it's whenever you revisit that formulation, you realize that they've continued to do that. You know, you could write a sequel to Mary's fantastic book and call it Still Making Enemies. But I do think that there's a part of it that, and again, getting back to how shocking it is of how little we really understand about the military. And there's always been, I think, an approach to try and understand them from an elite level, to try and look at, you know, the generals and the intrigues of Naypyidaw. And I've always been more interested in trying to understand the compulsion of soldiers on the ground and why they keep going. And I've interviewed, quite a few Burmese army soldiers over the years, and it's interesting. You know, some of them I've met who are like, if I'm retired, I'm in my late 60s, but if it was up to me, I would wear that uniform for the rest of my life. And it's, to me, it's we are the country. And people. I met this guy up in Kachin State who was incredibly tough. You know, he was 20 years older than me, and we were arm wrestling, and he was just beating the hell out of me. And I asked him where he served, and he was all over. He was in Shan State, he was in Karen State, Rakhine, and he spoke about the institution. He was a sergeant, and he was like, we're the ones that keep the country together. And he said it without a hint of irony. He said it without any kind of sly kind of double entendre. He really believed it. And he was from, I think he said he was from Sagaing, and he'd retired up in Indorji, and was still incredibly loyal to the institution. And you see that, I think, for a lot of activists and even scholars, and that it's almost like, no, the military is weak, and that they're just being kind of holding together. And there was a lot of predictions in 2021 that the military was about to fall apart. And I just didn't believe that. I think that there's an internal kind of group logic and a cohesion to this very class-based institution. It's almost like a caste system. The generals are up at the Brahmin level, and then there's the untouchables who are the foot soldiers. But yet somehow that translates not into resentment, but to loyalty. And whenever people talk about massive surrender rates and defections, and I do have to say, I think there's some confusion out there about desertions and defections, because they're very different things. But there's always enough people who stay loyal to the institution and keep fighting. And that's what I think is something that needs to be explored more. Where does that loyalty come from? And it's not just brainwashing, it's not just fear, it's not just that they've got their families locked back at the base. There's something more to it. There is actually a commitment to the institution that keeps a lot of people loyal and continuing to fight. And I don't really understand that. And it's something that I would like to know better. And that really means talking to as many members of the military and their families as one possibly can. So I do think that is a very urgent project.
But still, when you look at just the level of terror, sheer brutality, exploitation that has been taking place continuously for as long as it has, it's hard to understand how these acts are happening while there's also a sense of protector of the nation and loyal to the institution, and not just the blind greed, sheer violence, racism, destruction, and devastation. And maybe this is one of those unanswerable questions. Maybe this is the thing that you're pointing to, this is what doesn't make sense to me either, because I struggle with understanding, where reading one shade of description, understanding rationale, and then another one, where these two things fit in. How could you continue to believe in an institution that is also so front-loaded with acting against its own interests and making enemies and just taking as much as you can for as long as you can, and doing it while harming the most people? It's hard to see where this rationale and loyalty go with that level of violence and exploitation.
I think there's certainly that, and I think that you've got to approach looking at the Myanmar military while keeping multiple contradictions,
right.
you know, kind of arrayed around, and I think that their ability to live with those contradictions and not see them as contradictions so much as just accepting the fact that we're the force that's keeping the country together, while we're also selling out to the Chinese all the natural resources, and enriching just one class of officer, and it doesn't really, you know, come down to the working class soldier. And yet the working class soldier is like, well, I'm loyal to this institution because we're keeping the country together, even though I see all around me corruption, avarice, and incompetence, and complete contradictions, and it's like, well, you know, that's for someone else to decide. It's not really to me. And that a level of patriotism in keeping the country together, while selling out, I find it astonishing. But then, is it a form of just being very comfortable with living with hypocrisy, or is it a level of self-delusion that is like, well, that's necessary, you know, for us to protect the country, we need to kind of get rich. And I remember years ago when U Thein Sein came in as president, and there was a lot of quite unfortunate, I think, hagiography around U Thein Sein, and I remember people saying, "Oh, he's Mr. Clean," and you know, I was like, he was the commander of the Golden Triangle Command. Like, by definition, you can't be clean if you were running that command. It's the center of the drug trade. And speaking to a Shan friend who was like, look, comparatively he is clean because he never asks for anything. He just accepts the bribes and says, you know, give it to my wife. Whereas previous commanders like, I want that and I want that. And I said, that's the definition of clean, is that you don't ask for more than what you get. But again, I think it's this compulsion to try and find goodness in an institution, and try and find the one that you can deal with. And I think that was the mistake of you know, trying to find the good general. And of course, a lot of them were deeply corrupt, hypocritical figures who were seen as facilitators of international engagement. But since the coup, have all pledged loyalty to the SAC or have actually joined the regime. So I think we need to understand, we need to ask ourselves, are we really looking into the institution and seeing its contradictions and trying to uncover its manifold dark sides as multiple factors of inquiry, instead of projecting our own, you know, there's got to be good ones in the system. There's, I remember someone who worked on military engagement saying, you know, but you've got to understand they love their country. I'm like, well, it's a really bizarre kind of love when you're burning it down. I'm often hesitant to bring up contrast, but as you're talking, and I've never made this contrast in my mind before, I can't help but somehow think of what Trump has done to the base in America in terms of, and many people have pointed out since the beginning that you have someone who is his own life and policies are often against the interests of his biggest fan bases, as well as you could look at the patriotism and what he's doing to America, or the kind of America they say they want to live in, that I think if it comes to pass, few people would actually want to live in, but and it's, I think, is so opposed to the values that most Americans have, and yet there is a certain kind of patriotism and loyalty and us against them and populism that he has stirred up in my country, that there has been this rabid base that it sometimes have been working against and arguing against their own interest to want to support an institution that I think in our country, scholarship and journalism is still trying to uncover why this mass appeal, and why a mass appeal that actually doesn't make too much sense from the voting bloc that is going to support him. But the compulsion of people to work against their own self-interest is just staggering in so many different settings. And I think, you know, in line with trying to understand the military compulsion, I think we also have to try and understand the civilian support to the military. And, you know, I come from a military family. My father was a military policeman, and I have an inkling of that it's people who are proud to serve, and they see professionalism, and that's what my father was like. And I think that there's got to be an element of that. Militaries as an institution attract those kind of people who like the discipline, who like the the mission of serving the country and everything. But there's also, I think, similar to what you were saying about Trump supporters, it's people within Myanmar who I think perceive the military as keeping things together, and feeling proud to be from a family, whether it's officer class or NCOs. They feel that there's a certain nationalism that the military represents, a very Burma Buddhist nationalism. But then, again, the contradictions. Why are there so many Chin Christians who join the military and are very proud to have joined the military, even though the structural discrimination against their religion means that they can't move beyond colonel? That's something that I've never really understood. And the idea that a lot of Myanmar friends of mine, male friends, over the past few decades have said, before '88, I was a teenager and I wanted to join the military, and going to the Defence Services Academy in Maymeo was my dream. And one friend actually said he had an uncle who was a colonel in the military who talked him out of it and said, look, don't believe all of these myths about the Tatmadaw. They're not true. When we leave the base and we go out there in the mountains, we burn and kill everyone. And it's just, this is not for you, and don't believe these myths. And he said he was really shocked. And I've heard that from many other friends of that kind of '88 generation who were like, yeah, we really wanted to go to the DSA. At the time, because of the isolationism of Ne Win, it was the one institution in the country that you could socially advance. But there was a lot of perception that this is an institution holding the country together. And then I think during the Nawatai SPDC period, some of that probably went down, even though the military was expanding. And then during the transition, so-called transition, I think there were a lot of people going, well, things are open now. The military sidelined itself, so we don't really need to engage with it, even though it was doing terrible things in Kachin State and Karen State, and definitely in Rakhine. And since the coup, I think that there has been, and the military only has itself to blame, I think there has been this denouement where it's like everyone in the country, their eyes are now open to this institution because you're attacking everyone. And I think now is the time to kind of have this inquiry about what is this institution really, and what is its grip on society. And most importantly, I think, is to then go, how do we live beyond the Tatmadaw? And that's something that I'm really intrigued with, and bothering a lot of Myanmar friends of mine by asking too many questions about it. What's it going to look like? What will be left after an eventual victory? And we don't know when that's going to be or what it's going to look like. But yeah, that to me is what's going to happen to the institution, but what's going to happen to its civilian support base, and when are their eyes going to be open, or kind of a reckoning with our support has kind of led to this institution staying in power longer than it really needed to, and I think for any society going through that kind of violent transition, it's going to be very painful and it's going to be very contradictory. I don't think it's going to be this neat, glorious victory that so many people seem to be predicting. It's going to be a very painful reckoning with Myanmar's past.
Yeah, and when you talk about that civilian support and some of the contradictions that have been held over the years, I'm just thinking of the trajectory of, before the so-called transition, the really widespread distaste and lack of support among Bamars, as well as ethnics, of course, but among many Bamars, that was just something they saw oppressing them even before they knew what democracy was. And then all of a sudden, when you had this so-called transition period, you had these expressions on social media, signs that were billboards that were appearing, "We stand with the military, we stand with the Tatmadaw," and this proud and fierce alignment with seeing the military as their protector, and then a matter of years later seeing them again as their oppressor. So this extraordinary seesaw of going from protector to oppressor to protector to oppressor. It's almost like this abused partner or something in terms of how you look at this. And so at previous iterations, I never could have predicted that it would tilt all the way to the other side again as well.
During that period of the transition, whenever there was, and because there was far more intensive international engagement, and there was this initial narrative of Myanmar's the final frontier, and democracy's coming, and I think that there was a fair amount of Western triumphalism that they had a large part to do with that, which I think should be seriously questioned. This was a managed transition; it was a pacted transition, and that whenever there was that that narrative kind of was derailed with violence in Rakhine in 2012, the rise of the Marbathar and Wirathu, and that incredibly unfortunate Time magazine front cover of The Face of Buddhist Terror.
Yeah.
I think people naturally kind of reverted back into a nationalist stance of like, how dare you criticize the country? And it's like, well, the criticism was really directed against extremists in the military or the Sangha. But to me, it was very interesting how people kind of went back into this kind of patriotic defensive stance. And again, after 2016 and 2017, that was, and I think it was probably the most worrying element to me about the dehumanization of the Rohingya, was that there were people protecting or lauding the institution that had perpetrated, those mass atrocity crimes. And again, that kind of being able to carry contradictory thoughts in your head, I think there was a lot of people that just didn't really see that there was major contradictions there. And by the time of 2019 and Aung San Suu Kyi's lamentable, quite contemptible, going to the ICJ to defend the military, and regardless of what anyone says, she wasn't going to defend Myanmar. She was in effect defending the military. And if you read the full testimony that she came out with in that ludicrous International Commission of Inquiry report that the NLD put on, and I think that appeal to patriotism, the military reaped some dividends from that, and then squandered it completely with staging a coup. But I do think that given the downward spiral of the economy, the way that Myanmar's gone back into, all of the progress that was made is just being reversed now, as well as mass murder in Anya, and in so many other places around the country. I think that it's that anger about the reversal of the transition, and the economic hardships, and the military service law, put all these elements together. But there's something there too that I think so many people in the country have seen the military collapse in humiliating ways, from Kokang to Buthidan to Karen State, to Kachin State, and Sagaing, and places, and kind of thinking, my God, this really, they're not finished yet. But there's been a lot of humiliating surrenders, and I think a lot of people in the country are fully aware of that, and it's almost as like, this is a military that can be defeated, and I think Operation 1027 was really quite a major factor in that, but I do think that for a lot of people it's like, there's still going to be a lot of destruction. The killing's not over, unfortunately, but this military is possible to defeat, and I think in the long run that I don't think that even if the military holds on for some years, I don't think it can ever come back from that loss of prestige.
Do you think the military realizes that?
They must. Look, if you've been in a unit and you've been moved around the country several times, and you realise, everyone in the country, almost everyone in the country, from Mon State up to Kachin, Northern Shan, it's really only the Delta and Eastern Shan State that hasn't seen large-scale violence. But if you're in the military, you'd be like, look, it's just everywhere. And if you're in the Air Force, it must be like, well, every day we're going up 2 or 3 times a day to murder people from the air. But I take off and I could go north, south, east, west, and there's enemies everywhere. They definitely not. And I think, again, it's the resilience of their self-delusion that partly explains why they're moving forward. I think Min Aung Hlaing and many of the other gangsters at the top are just like robotics, the wrong term, because I think that lets them off the hook in some way, but they've convinced themselves of their own importance to such an extent that being delusional is reality.
But if they're so delusional, do they realize that that they're in a different place than they've ever been? Things aren't just going to be the same as they've always been for them.
They really must, because they've taken a pasting unlike anything in 70 years. And I think that there's probably a belief in their purpose, in their mission, their self-worth, but also increasingly a belief in overwhelming firepower. And I think we're seeing that when they murder scores of civilians with airstrikes and artillery strikes, I've heard this for the past 2 years, that this is this is the Sakasa being desperate. I don't think it's desperation at all. I think it's a tactic of war. I think it's them going, oh, you wanna resist us? We'll kill 150 of you. We don't care. Murdering civilians is something we've done for decades, and we'll continue to do it. And our strategy is as much as we can understand it. One element of their strategy of survival is murdering their way out of it, and that's a deplorable, disgusting realization, but you see the evidence for it every day across the country.
But why? One of the things that's been asked is that this has been their tactic, that they're a hammer and everything they see are nails. Why are they so incapable of innovating and realizing that this strategy is not, as much as they might like to do it, as much as it might make them feel powerful, that it's not actually working, and that there could be something else they could do equally insidious that could work more for them? And this is a question I've seen asked for years now, is why are they not innovating, and they're just doing the same thing over and over and having worse and worse results with it?
I think because they don't want to admit to themselves that it's a failing strategy. And if the famous definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, that's their approach to counterinsurgency. And I think that there's been periods in which, and Bertil Lintner writes very well about this, about the 1963 peace parley and the post 1989 standfast agreements. There was only one ceasefire signed with the Kachin, but all of these arrangements that were made, which were really stopgap methods. They weren't about peace and stability. And instead of having multiple peace processes where you sit down with the Arakan, you sit down with various Shan factions and definitely the Korean National Union and the Karenians, say, look, what's at the heart of your resistance? And because I don't think they've ever genuinely tried to understand the roots of grievances of ethnic insurgencies, and doing field work along the border and doing human rights work for many years. It's interesting how a lot of Western scholars and think tankers would subtly shift the blame onto ethnic communities and ethnic armed organizations, that it was their continued resistance that was causing all of this. And I would always push back on that and say, no, you've got the wrong end of the stick here. It's that the Nawata, the SPDC, they're not state building. This isn't counterinsurgency. This is punishment to get them to capitulate. And what you don't understand is that, I read this fascinating CIA document from the early 1970s that talked about what drove Kachin resistance. And it's like burning down villages, raping women and stealing chickens drives recruits into the Kachin army. And I remember reading that years ago and thinking, that kind of murder, grotesque sexual violence, looting, and just the culture of impunity has driven armed resistance and civilian support for that armed resistance for decades.
Yeah.
And I would tell people, it's like, look, don't go thinking because I'm a human rights person that I'm being human rights determinist here. This is the fundamentals of why, when you speak to civilians, why do you support the KNU? It's like, they protect me from that abusive military. And if that abusive military wasn't around, things would not be perfect, but they would be a damn sight better. And that's what I don't think people really understood, that the military just did not want to change from, we don't want to understand your grievances, let alone truly address them. And that was the insidious thing about the peace process from 2012, is that I don't think they were serious about fully understanding grievances then. And I still don't think they are. Otherwise, they would act in a very different way. There would be some calculation of, like, maybe obliterating a village and displacing tens of thousands of people isn't the way to kind of get them to stop fighting. And I think the sad thing is they seriously just don't think that. It's like, no, you need to surrender. You need to get down on your knees. That's not a very sophisticated approach, but then neither is their approach to counterinsurgency. There's no sophistication at all. It's a battering ram.
It is. One of the things you talked about earlier was looking at the type of scholarship that, even though scholarship has grown over the years from when you first started, there's so much available now in so many different forms that you could read and learn, and yet you also talk about certain categories of analysis that you would like to see more of, but then you mention it's not just the subject matters that you would like to see a change in scholarship, it's also the perspective and the backgrounds of the scholars themselves, and this has been a hot topic of late. Burma studies, the quote unquote archetype of the Burma expert, and looking at what representation means among scholars in Burma studies.
I have to first start out by saying that the concept of a Burma expert is absurd, and there's literally no scope to be an expert on something that constantly confuses you. And so I do think people should be a bit more circumspect about some of the assertions that they make. And I think that there's a difference between, being a talking head like me and being part of the commentariat as opposed to being a scholar. And I think that there's a lot of great scholarship out there that really tries to dig deeper, but I think what I'm thinking of is the ability to have conversations with classically trained scholars who are in universities and have done all the hard work to get where they are, but also people who do, perhaps one way of saying it, more applied work on that mixes. I think I kind of traverse between being a hopeless scholar, dabbling in journalism, even though I'm not a journalist, and kind of feeling relatively safe calling myself an analyst because it's broad enough to kind of encompass different perspectives. And as someone who reads a lot of academic work, because I think it's fantastic, but also a lot of journalism and a lot of great think tank perspectives, because I do think it needs to be a multidiscipline approach. Because things are so complicated and we know so little about so much. So yeah, I do think that I'm particularly obsessed, I think, with this deeper understanding of the coercive side of Myanmar society and the institutions of coercion, whether it's the SITAT or whether it's the EAOs. And I would actually say a lot of things that we say about the Myanmar military being this kind of big question mark about its internal logic, and I would say the same thing about the ethnic armed organisations as well. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what drives their membership, their leadership, and how they're perceived within their own society. And I think anyone that thinks that all of the EAOs are absolutely lionised and venerated in their own societies is just not. That's just not the case. I remember being in Myitkyina and 10 years ago now, and speaking with a good friend, a great Kachin intellectual, and he said, "Hey, next time you're in Naypyidaw, tell Thein Sein to thank you for attacking us because you've united the Kachin people like nothing before. And he was being glib, but he basically says, before the ceasefire was broken, we would yell insults to Kachin Independence Army officers we'd see walking down the street. And then getting attacked and
Sure.
it did kind of unify not all parts of Kachin society, because I think it's a lot more atomized and divided than people often think. But there is that sense of like, well, when there is a lot more group cohesion when you are attacked, and people, I've often heard this from people who live in Korthule, that they have a very sophisticated understanding of the Korean National Union, and that they see it in a multi-dimensional way. It's a protector, but it's also can be a tyrant at times. It can be, and some leaders are, a lot of leaders are good, and some leaders are bad. But and what I've noticed over the years is like, people within these communities want to talk in their own way about these institutions that shape their lives. They don't necessarily want outsiders and foreigners knowing too much about it, which I can fully understand. But it's always fascinating when you do get those insights into group cohesion and loyalty towards different armed groups, because I think it mirrors Burma Buddhist perceptions of the military, that it's like, well, it's kind of a benevolent element, but that it's also problematic, and an agenda that tries to unpack some of those social relations within highly militarized societies, I think is one approach of one of many approaches.
And looking at the Burma studies field and the scholarship that's been coming out and that will continue to come out, how important do you feel it is to have more of a focus and emphasis on local representation? What is it that a scholar coming from the country can do with a topic that an outside observer may be challenged with, and then going off on that logic of that question, what sorts of kind of continued assumptions or misunderstandings or misses have you seen the international community or scholarship coming from international observers that has been a result of this lack of representation?
What I've noticed, and maybe this is just because of a few academic articles that I've read in the past several weeks, is this very admirable challenging of international assumptions and international ways of doing things. Right. There was a great article that a PhD student from the University of Melbourne was the lead author in, called "Seeing Like a Donor," and I find that a very important piece of challenging Western donors' ways of making civil society legible, and the negative consequences sometimes that can be. There's also been great scholarship on challenging international engagement with Myanmar and some international approaches that have been either hypocritical, flawed, or completely contradictory. And I think one, there was a report that came out and about women, peace and security, and just how dreadful a lot of the international support for that was, and how the peace process excluded a lot of women's voices, and which should have been at the core of the peace process. And so I do like that there are a lot of Myanmar scholars that are pushing back on the kind of the imperialist mindset that often comes through international engagement. And that's partly because I'm very critical of Western engagement. So when I see Myanmar scholars do the same thing, I'm encouraged. But there's also a lot of other fantastic work that's being done from what I hear from Myanmar friends is it's their design, it's their ideas. They're not trying to be molded in the shape of Western scholarship. They're trying to find their own questions and ways to come to their own answers. And that to me is really exciting stuff, because it's stuff that, there's a lot of stuff that we as foreigners, we just don't see, we don't fully understand.
Yeah.
And I'm always up to being corrected, and it's amazing how often that needs to happen. And I do have to pay huge respects to my Myanmar friends for having a great deal of patience when they deal with me on this. But that to me is what really needs to be done. And instead of kind of going, well, I'd like to know about this, and this. No, I actually want Myanmar scholars to go, no, actually, I'm choosing what to look at.
Sure.
And then take it or leave it.
Yeah.
And, I'll definitely take it, because that to me is the interesting turn. But also, I think that there's a lot of other international scholars that are kind of doing similar things, kind of asking different questions, and trying to. David Brenner wrote a fantastic piece several months ago on looking at the transition through the lens of democracy, and he was being very critical. And I know lots of Myanmar friends really appreciated that article, because it was very kind of current with the way that they were kind of looking at modes of international engagement. And I do think it's important to have that kind of multidisciplinary approach. Now, in a time of revolution, I think it is important to reflect on these things, because there will come a time when that critical thinking and those multiple perspectives from academia, from development work, and from civil society work, when they start. I mean, if this is an intersectional revolution, then I think knowledge should be intersectional, and it's got to come from think tanks like ISP and Mosaic and Salween, doing absolutely brilliant work. And then all of these great scholars, and a lot of these people are friends. They all know each other. It's networks of friendship and work that I think is incredibly positive. And I think great work comes from that. And I think there's ample evidence out there.
I think that's especially true at a time or in a place where history just keeps repeating itself, and it's really stunning I've had this experience myself in the last few years. I've talked to guests who've reported the same things, that they're in the middle of whatever's happening in Myanmar, they happen to pick up a book talking about 1988 or even some iteration before that, and they're reading it and suddenly feel like, wait a second, am I reading about something contemporary or reading about something before? The more that knowledge is coming from the contours of what worked, what didn't, what the challenges were, what the responses were, that will inform what we know about going forward as well. And I think that also when we're looking at the direction of scholarship, and you talk about the agency of taking up new, not just in how topics are approached, but in how topics are chosen, and that agency, and not just looking at things in a different way, but looking at choosing what it is you want to look at, and the networks going forward. I also want to go back and look at where we came from. And I've often felt this is one of the rationales of why Inside Myanmar podcast exists, even though it started more in exploring spiritual journeys and more with the Buddhism perspective and background. But this sense that I found Myanmar always put in kind of reductionist terms, that it was very much, there were certain overriding ideas that were put out there, whether in journalism or more so I found in journalism, or even in my case in Buddhism, just talking to different Buddhist teachers and seeing how the country was represented in kind of mythological Orientalist Buddhist lens. And certainly you see that with policy as well. It's always been international policy that foreign countries have towards Myanmar. It's always been my feeling that bad information leads to bad policies, and a 2-hour long-form sit-down interview with someone brings out much more nuance and details and colors than you get in just the headlines that you then try to fill the content with. But going back and looking at those previous iterations and years of scholarship, because you've been someone who has just read so exhaustively different scholars, different eras, different types of publications. You've talked about where it's going forward, but I wonder if you could talk about where it's been, and if you could talk about some of the problems that you've seen in previous decades of how you might define a limited scope, or unexamined assumptions, or just a narrowing of perspectives, an unimagined kind of the lack of imagination that some of the scholars and academics were bringing to it, that then started to shape the understanding of wider outsiders, whether they were casual readers or journalists or academics or people in policy and government, whoever, diplomats, whoever it was, that we're now breaking out of. But how you would describe some of that narrowing scope in previous decades, and then the consequences of whatever that narrow scope was?
It's fascinating to look back at that during the 1990s, Burma became this relatively minor example of the post-Cold War end of history, triumph of democracy and human rights, and usually through the lens of Aung San Suu Kyi. But this very neatly packaged narrative formed in the 90s that, here's this exotic Asian woman and this kind of caricatured evil military regime, with an incredibly sinister sounding acronym that the Economist once called like the name of some nasty alien planet. And from then, I think, in a lot of international narratives, Burma was not allowed to be complicated. And it was like, no, I don't want...
Right.
She's great, they're bad, and
then you got Buddhist monks.
And they're fantastic, and they're completely infallible. Well, you might want to spend more time kind of being there and actually speaking to different people. And by, I think, association, a lot of the ethnic armed organizations were kind of exonerated in some way, or really quite marginalized, actually. I mean, it was something about the Civil War, because it wasn't raging to the intensity as it had been in different eras during the 1990s and the 2000s. It was really just Karen State and Karenni and a couple of other places where there was still ongoing fighting. But also, I think the way that international activism perceived Myanmar, which really had an oversized impact on policymaking and an oversized impact on journalism. And a lot of the Myanmar exiled opposition complex was not a democracy and human rights movement. It was a solidarity movement. It downplayed some unfortunate realities, and front-loaded other features. And the National Coalition Government of the Union of Burma was not very effective, and we're seeing kind of shades of that. It's interesting to reflect on 30 years ago and seeing some of the compulsions of people in exile, that they believe narratives that kind of fit, where they are in Buffalo, New York, or in Europe. Whereas on the ground, people are like, no, things are a lot more complicated. It's not clear at all, what's going on, and there's lots of incredibly difficult decisions to make. And I think that there are parallels. I think the era is completely different, and large parts of Burma could be considered to be basically a black hole back then. It's like, well, not to the people who were there. They saw it as they're living their lives. And one thing that always struck me about traveling around Myanmar when I first went in '96 and then '97 and then subsequent trips is that it was an incredibly vibrant place. And people could not like the military, could be really bitter about how living standards and educational standards had been degraded under military rule, but also get on with life. I found that really quite inspiring. I didn't really know what I was expecting, but I was heartened to see that, and I that was something that I'll always remember. That there was incredibly crushing poverty, and if you were a journalist or a poet and you tried to speak out, you'd be tortured and sent to prison. It was a police state, and there was coercion everywhere, and yet there were people kind of just trying to navigate around that and still having a great sense of humor and taking care of their families and getting along. And I think that would still hold true now. Having not been back in the country since the coup, I can't imagine that it's any different. Looking back, I think the way that the world understood Myanmar was very simplistic.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like, well, the military aren't changing, let's sanction the hell out of them. So,
Mm-hmm.
is that really the only thing to do? You can't talk to them. It's like, well, you should be talking to them. You don't trust them, but you should actually be finding a way. And this is, 10, 15 years ago. And I think what resulted from that, which is really unfortunate, and when I was doing human rights advocacy in Washington, some of the other people doing it could conjure up the most outrageous exaggeration, and you would get sophisticated policymakers and people believing it. And I remember thinking, no, that's not happening. What are you talking about? So you could basically say, I remember walking into a meeting with a US official in the National Security Council, and he said, I went and saw that Rambo 4 film last night with my wife because I knew I was going to be seeing you today. Yeah. Wow, like, you have to live through that? And I was like, no, sir, I mean, come on. Mm-hmm. It's, there's bad things happening in Karen State, but not to that extent. And I had to kind of, he just hadn't really read anything on Myanmar. There was no sophisticated intelligence coming through, so we had to go see Sylvester Stallone, duking it out in the mountains of Chiang Mai.
Goodness.
With a former ABSDF guy playing the evil Tatmadaw commander.
Yeah.
The level. I mean, I think that there was a lot of deep concern, and it's interesting reading Scott Marcial's, the former ambassador Scott Marcial's fantastic book, where he talked about when he was in East Asia and the Pacific Bureau, just how much time they spent on Burma.
That surprised you?
I knew it at the time because I knew Ambassador Marcial back then and would go to the State Department. I knew that there was a lot of attention, and that was coming from the White House. Barbara Bush, the First Lady, was very interested at the time, and lots of people in Congress, from Mitch McConnell to others. There was a huge amount of concern and a lot of passion, and not necessarily the sophisticated information to back it up, to buttress it.
Yeah.
And I'm not ever going to doubt the genuine concern people like Senator McCain
I think so.
And many others really had.
And bipartisan concern.
And it was bipartisan.
Yeah.
And a lot of US officials who would go to Burma in the 1990s would really give the SLORC leaders a really hard time.
Yeah.
Which was good, but then it wasn't necessarily followed up with a more sophisticated set of measures that balance sanctions, which were always going to be there regardless of their efficacy. I do think a rather unhealthy relationship developed then between the State Department and Congress. And I've never really believed in that level of activism of where you go and demand that the State Department does something, knowing that they're not really capable of doing everything that you're demanding. And then you run to daddy in Congress and get someone in Congress to write a nasty note to the White House to keep... To me, that kind of confrontational approach is not necessarily healthy. And it's more about trying to inform people and persuade them with evidence and with clear logic. And unfortunately, evidence and clear logic have been largely absent in international activism on Myanmar. And I think post-coup, it has been better. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as it was 20 years ago or more. But I still think that there are flashes of you're exaggerating that for effect, knowing that you're jazzing it up a bit. It's not necessarily true. And I just never think that's a commendable approach, because I think people, decision makers, then if they realise they're being hoodwinked in some way, they're not going to trust you again. And I think trust is the core strength of the human rights movement. And unfortunately, you see kind of people cutting corners and kind of exaggerating things, taking them out of context. And I've always been very frustrated that that seems to be acceptable when you're working on Myanmar. And I know it frustrates the hell out of lots of Burmese friends. It's like, you're miscasting my society. You're miscasting the conflict that I'm caught up in, that you have, that doesn't impact you. You're just a Western interloper coming in. So yeah, I do think, 3 decades ago, there were lots of people just, it was the opportunity to kind of make Burma this poster child for international human rights advancement.
Yeah.
But that necessitated downplaying a lot of things. And I think 2007 and the demonstrations, and to my a lot of people get angry when I say this, but it wasn't a saffron revolution. It was neither a revolution nor were many people wearing saffron, and that kind of was conjured up by some activists. I've never kind of really understood if the members of the Sangha of that movement came up with it themselves. But also in me and lots of colleagues at Human Rights Watch worked really hard on this report that we did on that. And the group of us did a lot of interviews, and what really came through was how the Ponji that were involved in leadership, this was all about social distress. This was all about saying the people are suffering, you've got to do something, and we're in the vanguard of alerting the authorities to what you're doing to society. And we found that a far more compelling argument than this is a democracy and rights movement, which we never, I think it was wrapped up in that in some way, but this is really about, no, the people are suffering and you've got to do something about it. And then this kind of veneration for the Sangha as an institution, and I remember thinking at the time, there's always going to be dark sides to any kind of, and it was a very West Coast hippie kind of thing, and people at Human Rights Watch loved it. Bertil Lindner actually did a really good report for Human Rights Watch on the resistance of the monks, which was really interesting to work with him on that. But Bertil, I think, nailed it when he said, don't go looking at a religious institution like this as an instrument of social change. It's not the right one. You've got to actually build up stronger institutions, and this is, the Sangha came out to create space for the people to come in afterwards. They weren't going to lead a revolution, and I think that was all kind of lost, and again it was like, the monks are kind of leading the charge, and it's like, no, it's kind of not really like that. And again, it was kind of this misstep in analysis that unfortunately happens from time to time when you're looking at Burma.
It's such a compelling story. The visuals, the way that Buddhism has for half a century has been portrayed in the West, and the way that we've understood or misunderstood it, and the way that was crafted was really it hit its mark. It hit every metric you could want in Western society to send chills up and give goosebumps for, and good on them for being able to know how to impart and communicate a message to a foreign audience that had it struck. But then it did also leave a lot of questions in terms of, the Sangha is, I often like to say that I believe the Burmese Sangha is so misunderstood because they all wear the same clothes and they all have the same hairstyle. And so because of that, we tend to think that they're this kind of boring monolith organization that hasn't changed over time. And that's their internal message as well. We're following the 2,500 years of the history of the Buddha and Vinaya and his regulations. And, it's actually because this has been my own primary interest and passion in Myanmar for so long, and my own exploration coming to the country, being someone actively engaged in meditation and wanting to learn the roots of that you do learn how dynamic this institution is, and how many different voices there are, and the struggles and the inner conflicts that they've had to try to understand who they are and how they are living and what their impact is with Burmese society, with lay society, and the different ideas and formulations of what that can mean, whether it's different meditation methods and who gets to practice, and how those methods are verified by either your progress or by looking at the suttas and scholarship. censorship, and and so much else. And so I think that in and of itself is something that causes something of a conundrum. It looks like this boring patriarchal religious traditional organization. I was going to say it's anything but. It is that, and it's also anything but at the same time. Yeah. And you talk about contradictions. As someone like me coming from this background, one of the things that I've tried to impart, it took me years, if not decades, to get to the point that I could even recognize what this fundamental contradiction was, because I myself was so confused, because I was coming from a meditator background more than a political background, and then started to encompass those views. And coming from a meditator background where many of my peers were meditators, meditation teachers, Westerners who become monks or nuns, who were dedicating their life to a spiritual practice, were eschewing the material world, and et cetera, that to me, my early engagement with Myanmar, especially with the Sangha and Burmese Buddhism, was based on this is a living embodiment of the foremost experts of mindfulness anywhere in the world. This is where the rest of the world comes to learn about mindfulness, and that is true. That is a true statement. We can get into the other things about it that are complicated, but that itself is true, that there is that those people that are on a path of general spiritual wisdom, but in particular Theravada Buddhism, that they want to be able to discover and explore. Myanmar is the golden land. It is the place where you come and where you gain that, and so. It's also if you read Eric Braun's book on Lady Sayadaw, or some of the scholarship that's coming out on the Goenka movement, or Mahasi, this is the birthplace of, and there's still a lot of scholarship left to be done to really understand this properly, but this is the birthplace of the worldwide mindfulness movement, in a way that has taken different forms and has taken many different forms, but seeds were planted in 19th and 20th century Burma. And so, the Sangha does represent this extraordinary call to mindfulness of all peoples, of all ages, of all backgrounds, being able to move beyond a Buddhist label and definition. And this is true, this is inspiring, this is wonderful. At the same time, the Sangha also represents a nationalist and anti-Islam and racist and patriarchal, and there are those elements there as well. And I think for me, I struggled so much to understand and contemplate how to hold both those truths. I just didn't. I didn't know how to live with one and deny the other, or to see where they came together. And it seems like such a simple formulation, but it took me, I don't know how long, to be able to realize, well, both are involved. And when we're saying the Sangha is like this or like that, we're not doing it justice. We're not being accurate in trying to properly describe what an institution is, because all of those things are there. And it's not just those things. It's not just that there's these two polarities. There's so many more, of course. There's the idea of it being the immense social services it provides, of education and orphans and filling in the gaps and community arbiters and food and now refugee centers and medical clinics and so much else that it's able to do in there as well. It's also a place where all the problems that have happened with the Myanmar economy, where when someone doesn't have much of a place to go, they fall there. They become a monk or a caretaker or a nun, or whether they're a child or an elderly person or someone just down on their luck, that they know they can always stop in there. And so I think I think it's natural for the mind, when it uncovers something new, to want to give it a label or a definition to understand it and say, well, okay, well, this is like this. And I think, so it's natural that we would want to understand the Sangha as either, this is the source of the mindfulness movement and that's gone around the world, or this is this hateful patriarchal institution that was really giving some kind of justification to the murderous regime and doing it in return for money and certificates and property and whatever else. But, at the end of the day, all these things are true. And we somehow, as it is with Myanmar, as it is with the AOs, with the military, with everything else, as it is with the Sangha, we somehow have to be able to hold this, at times, incredibly uncomfortable nuance. And uncomfortable because it depends on which background you're coming from. If you're coming from the background of a meditator, let me tell you, it is very uncomfortable to be able to hold your gratitude and really hold it, while also acknowledging that this institution has done these terrible, hateful things. it is equally uncomfortable, and I can tell you I've seen this from experience of conversations I've had, someone coming from a human rights background or political background, and being able to hear or acknowledge the role that it's played in this mindfulness movement and in this education, and yet we somehow have to be broad enough to admit that this institution is doing both and doing a lot of other things as well. It's like with Myanmar, it's really complicated.
It definitely is, and it's, I think, using that as an example of holding those two contradictions, that, from 2007, 2008, when the Sangha was seen internationally as this, amazing force for social change and staring down a brutal military dictatorship, and then 6 years later, this shock of Wirathu and the Mabathar and lurching, into like all monks are evil. And
Yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
No, wait.
Yeah.
And it was, I had to approach the Mabathar and that kind of extremism and nationalism from a human rights and political perspective. But I'll always be thankful to friends who are scholars that were able and could speak Pali, and Burmese was amazing, and actually spent time in researching the religious dimension of the country, and who were really, I'll always be grateful for how they kind of talked me through a lot of this complexity, for me personally. But what I found was that trying to translate that complexity back to the human rights world and to journalism and to international advocacy was really difficult. And I think part of it was and I saw this with perspectives around Aung San Suu Kyi as well. Like, how could you do this to me? And this sense of betrayal. I'm like, well, you need to get over yourself, because it's not about you. It's about the country and the society. And there was this sense of like, oh, damn. Then I was like, look, not all monks are raving psychopaths now. You can't lurch from one overblown narrative to the opposite.
It went so fast.
And it went so fast. And I remember engaging with the Mabathar. I went up to Insane Seador and met some of the lay supporters, and they showed me all the piles of the For Race and Religion petitions that they got all the signatures on, and I remember some diplomats going, "Why did you do that?" I'm like, you need to understand this phenomena, and you do that by going and speaking to people. And I'm a human rights advocate. That, do I just speak to people that I know will agree with me? Like, that's not how it works. Or it shouldn't be how it works. And I stayed in touch with them, and I went to the celebration event of the For Race and Religion laws with a Myanmar scholar who just happens to be a Muslim, which I thought was pretty interesting. But he was incredibly good at explaining what was going on to me, because there were so many dimensions of this that given his research on this, and he had a very open-minded, sophisticated approach to what was going on. And it struck me that there were a handful of journalists, Western journalists there. There were a lot more Myanmar journalists, which makes sense because they actually can understand what's going on around them and can process it so much better. But it struck me as a lot of Western entities just were so like burnt from this lurch from 2007 to 2003 that it's like we just don't want to understand the Mabathar. They're all screaming racist. And there was some very good work done by Western scholars and Myanmar scholars trying to unpack the Mabathar and just go, look, it's not necessarily anti-Islamic. It's pro-Buddhist. And there's a lot of social dimensions to this that make sense if you understand Anya society. If you understand their role, especially the role of women, lay women supporters of the Mabathar in Sagaing. And then this whole, and it was amazing how many people internationally, like in journalism and others, I was like, I don't think the Mabathar is necessarily welcome in Rakhine. Like, they've got their own kind of Rakhine conservative outlook on this, And there were Marbathar chapters up in northern Shan State that we would see, but they're basically there for they're looking after IDPs and looking after poor people in towns and things. They're not like they've probably got pretty odious views about Muslims and minorities, but where's the violence that you see around you? It didn't spark this kind of nationwide pogrom that a lot of people internationally were predicting, and that's the other thing. There's always this tendency to jump into problems in Myanmar, whether it's Facebook or the Marbathar or of other things, and kind of predict what it's going to look like. And it's like you don't necessarily, you haven't assembled the evidence, to make that conclusion yet. You've got to do your research, and that was always a very frustrating thing to try. When you're there as an individual trying to understand it yourself and recognizing that it's incredibly complicated, and yet you're being assailed with all of these international narratives of it's one thing or another, and realizing that there's people who just kind of, and I think Twitter's an absolutely terrible invention, but people see one thing and then they assume that they know, and again, something I alluded to before, it was incredibly frustrating. All these people had never been to Burma, never really understood anything, never really read anything, but consider themselves an expert. I remember the board of directors for Human Rights Watch came in 2014, and there's a big group, about 80 people, and we all jumped on the buses and we were going from Traders Hotel down around Sule Pia to make a left-hand turn, and then we were going around the city for meetings, and I remember some of the higher-ranking people there were like, "Oh, David, is that there's a mosque on the right-hand corner of Sule Pia?" They're like, "Oh, is that the central mosque?" And I was like, "There's mosques all the way up and down that street." They're like, "What?" And I said, "This is downtown is a Muslim quarter," and they were absolutely shocked. They assume that in 2014 the Marbathar would have burnt every mosque, and I was like, "No," and I was like, "You like, okay, I'm taking you for a walk later. Like, you've got to walk around. You can walk into those mosques." I said, "The synagogue's right there." And they were like, "What?" And I said, "Look, I think you've just been completely misinformed about." I said, "Look, there's a lot of tension and a lot of concerns, but this is a multicultural city. And there's a lot more religious tolerance than you would think. Not necessarily religious understanding, but it's people just getting on with things." And so I was always struck by how during that transition, so-called transition period, there was just a lot of misunderstanding about the state and society, not just the military, but also about religion and interethnic relations as well.
It is. It's incredible how the macro could have certain kind of stories and narratives, but the micro has kind of a different life, and not that one negates the other, but that you have to encompass this view and recognize where and hold this nuance of where things don't really line up, and somehow you have to just hold that. And I was telling someone the story the other day that I hadn't thought about this for a while, but it goes in line with what you were saying about this diversity. At one time, I met the Israeli ambassador, and he wanted to take me to an old Jewish cemetery and show it to me. And so we got in a car, and his driver and bodyguard of the car was Roman Catholic Burmese, but he was Roman Catholic Burmese. We arrive at the gates of the cemetery, and the gatekeeper is Hindu woman that's overseeing the cemetery. We walk in, and he shows me, and the graves are very unusual, and he explains these are in Iraqi Jewish style. So it was a 100-year-old Iraqi Jewish style grave. And while we're there, I hear coming from one corner the Muslim call to prayer, but then all around there are Buddhist monasteries with novices chanting. And I think, where else in the world at a single moment in time, I've just counted 6 major religions that are all happening simultaneously and coming from different cultural backgrounds. And so it really is remarkable, that depth of diversity, cultural and religious, ethnic diversity that you experience. And But then also going back to some of your observations about the way that these narratives come about, scrolling on Twitter, getting a quick headline. I'm recalling a conversation we had here at a podcast with Ashin Kovida. I really recommend listeners to check that out if they haven't. It was one of the ones that really stayed with me as a host and really taught me a lot in many, many ways. But one of the things is he talked about when the journalists started descending during this so-called transition and speaking, wanting to talk to monks about the rise of Mabata. He reached out while they were in town talking to Ruatu. He was saying, hey, talk to me and talk to us.
Absolutely.
We don't agree with what they're doing. We don't like it. We're fighting against it. We're we're positioning our monks in the Sangha in a different way. And, we talk to him and talk to many others. They're like, Ruatu's not a monk. Like, he's not a Buddhist monk at all. He's a charlatan in robes. And in Kovida's telling, no one would talk to him. The way he put it was that a tiger attacking a man is not a story, but a man attacking a tiger is. And so, again, going back to this kind of trope of a peace-loving Buddhist faith that is being violent, this is something that attracts. And you referenced that Time magazine cover, the face of Buddhist terror. I remember exactly the moment in time when I saw it. I was not engaged when that came out. I was not so much in the doing so much with training, which was my background, or the political. I'd spent years at that point at different monasteries in rural areas, so I was coming from very much of a meditative kind of monastic standpoint, and the cover of that, the cover and the title and everything, it shocked and it floored me. Later, I came to know Hannah Beach, the author of that article, and over time, I started to ask her about the nature of that article and kind of gently share my reaction to that cover, and to which was not a positive reaction. It would take a long time to kind of flesh out, coming from coming from this monastic background for several years and kind of knowing the colonial past and how and in what ways the experience of colonialism had straightened this Buddhist faith, and the fear that it was at risk, and kind of the fears that I felt this cover playing into. And as I talked to her, talked to Hannah Beach about it, she floored me in saying, "Oh, I hated that cover. That was the last thing
absolutely.
I wanted." She said that wasn't even what the article was about.
Absolutely.
I pleaded with them not to do it, and as she said that, I was like, and she started to tell me what the article was about, and I started to think, and I was like, oh, I actually never read the article. I actually never even read it.
The article's actually quite good.
Yeah.
It was actually really interesting. Hannah's fantastic. There was a huge disconnect between, and I would say to people, read the article. Just rip off the front cover, try and ignore it, even though it's impossible to ignore, and read the article, because it's comparing Thailand and Burma. And it's, I thought she did a pretty good job. I've heard some people criticize the article, but I actually really liked it, because she was really trying to get into something deeper. Yeah. And I think that's the unfortunate thing that was missed, is that Hannah was actually trying to address these contradictions.
But it was so sensationalist.
Yes, absolutely.
That cover and the way that it called out. Another thing, we talk about how fast these things shifted, and it reminds me that some years ago I was reading a fiction book about Burma. I don't remember what it was, but somehow I thought, I hadn't heard of it until some time, so I had this idea that I think this was like, mid 2010s, this book came out. And so I'm reading it, and there's a scene in the book where in the first chapter, where some monks are kind of in the shadows in this building. And so because I think the book is written in transition, I'm kind of in my mind thinking, oh, these are kind of sinister monks and they're doing some insidious action. And instead, the monk plays this noble role of kind of taking in someone from the street that's in danger and protecting them and speaking some words of wisdom and protecting them. And I'm just reading this thinking, like, what is going on? There's some disconnect in my mind. What's happening? I can't really figure out what it is. And then I go to the copyright page and I check, and it's like, published 2008 or whatever it was. Right. And I was like, oh, that's what's going on. The monks are in the 2008 mold, not the 2015 mold. And it was so fascinating to see how these narratives had changed so fast, and then they went into popular fiction, nonfiction, journalism, scholarship, policy, everything, because it was just that huge shift from one to the other.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there was also at that time I was involved with a religious study group that one of the Western donors put on, and it was Buddhist monks, a Muslim woman, Hindu, Catholic. I think that was it. And it was a really interesting group, and it was, I was doing seminars on like the citizenship law and list of 135 national races, and challenging some basic assumptions. And it was fascinating to hear from them about their perspectives, but also quite shocking how there's this very Western compulsion, religions for peace, and if we all get together and everything will be great. I'm very skeptical of that, because I think when you try and force that, it becomes laboured, and it probably creates more friction than it does peace. And so I'm always very skeptical in Myanmar, kind of trying to use religious figures, definitely use religious figures for trying to call for calm and everything. But and we've seen that with Cardinal Bo, disappointing a lot of Catholics. Although some of my friends who are Catholics are like, no, we never liked him to start with. And so trying to reflect on, maybe maybe you should try and understand all of these religious institutions better before you try and use them.
Yeah.
And I do think there was a lot of donors going, no, this will work, and in the same way that when I speak to young people from Kachin, there's not an overwhelming veneration of the Kachin Baptist Convention. A lot of them, especially women, see it as a controlling institution, as a coercive institution, and I think even a lot of, I remember speaking to the Mansu Sayadaw in Lasho several years ago, and asking him, are you speaking to all of these different armed groups, the Restoration Council of Shan State Progress Party, Shan State Army North, and others, because there's a lot of suffering up here, and people, and he was telling me and colleagues when we went to visit him, he said, I just had like several hundred IDPs here from Namtu, and I sent them back this morning because the fighting stopped. But he said, drive to Namtu and speak to them, and we asked him about what role him and other members of the Sangha were playing in kind of conflict mediation, and he said it's gone too far for that. And he said, we went to this religious ceremony, and a few of us got together, like senior Sayadaws that got together and said, look, the people are really suffering, and there's lots of human rights violations that these ethnic armed organisations are perpetrating. And he said he approached 4 or 5 of these Sayadaws approached some of the armed group leaders and said, look, we really want to talk to you about this and try and engage you. And they said, you beggars have come, you've got your gifts, now go away. I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, they were really disrespectful. And he said, they just, look, they're stuck into these cycles of conflict, and they're all fighting each other for territory and everything. And he said, there's just no role for us to play at this time. And he said, I don't think there's anything that could be done. It's like this period of desperate fighting between all of these groups that you've got to get through. And so, I don't think, I think that like a lot of things during that transition, there was a lot of assumptions about what we think we know, and not a lot of deeper understanding. And a lot of international systems brought in and imposed on structures that the people spending the money didn't necessarily fully understand.
Can you give an example of that?
Social cohesion. It was a buzzword. You go to different offices and embassies and around Yangon, and everyone was like, social cohesion will win the day. And I just, I speak to friends from Arakan, and they're like, social cohesion was an absolute joke.
Do you mean the way they went about it, or the very idea?
The way that they went about it. And I think the idea of it was very different from a Myanmar. And I'm thinking of Rakhine here. Moreover, that people I would speak to in Rakhine was like, why can't you Westerners let us reconnect in an organic way between Rakhine Buddhist and Rohingya Muslim and other communities and that were involved, Chin Christians and others. You're constantly coming up here with a timetable and a workshop kind of thing, and writing your reports. Like, maybe if you weren't involved, we would be getting back together. And I remember an official of the Myanmar state, so not someone that I would fully trust, but he said, after the floods in 2015, which were particularly bad in many parts, and he said the community had been divided by the violence of 2012. He's like, they're starting to come back together and kind of share things. And he said, just you guys stay out of it, because if you turn up with all your programs, you're going to mess it up. It's their communities, let them come back. And of course, that's never going to be perfect. It's always going to be fraught with and given the imbalance in the rights that the two communities had, it was always going to be very difficult. But I did see a lot of people kind of, we need to do social cohesion, and it's like you're casting the society as sick before you've even done a proper diagnosis. And who are you? And I'm not saying that I understand the social relations between different ethnic groups, but I understand they exist. And yet there was a lot of programming that was just like, well, I've got 2 years to make everyone be nice and happy, and it's like you're doing this to make large-scale development projects more palatable, and peace processes kind of stick, but you kind of I thought there was a lot of flawed approaches, and I think it frustrated a lot of communities from what I was hearing. It was just like, oh God, these foreigners come in and tell us how we are and how we should be, and like, how would you feel if I came to your country and did that?
There's so much money and ego on the line, though, from these. It's hard to imagine a foreign approach being able to change course when, as we mentioned, Myanmar is this last final frontier, this at that stage, and to think of the ego that's on the line, the reputations that are on the line, that were just flying such hyperspeed at the time, of different individuals, personalities, organizations that were just in full belief that they were the ones that were going to save the day and lead the way, and the money that's there for it. It's hard to imagine ever trying to put that toothpaste back in the tube.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Once it started, and everyone predicted that it was going to be a gold rush when it started, or even before it started, and it was even worse than I feared, and there was just so much folly, ego, competition. Competition between Western states, even before we get into competition between the West and Japan and China, and I remember, I think it was about 2013, and this very senior American official was coming through town, and I was at a briefing with other colleagues, quite diverse colleagues, and this American official came through and was like, so what's going on? And we started telling her about, Aung San Suu Kyi is not the beacon of democracy and rights, and Buddhist nationalism is on the rise, but it's being kind of miscast in some ways, and we were just, from my briefing, I said, look, the military hasn't changed. It's just as abusive as ever. And some of the reforms are genuine, absolutely, but I think that there's just way too much optimism. And she was furious. She was like, I've got to go to Napier and meet Aung San Suu Kyi for lunch on the weekend. What are you telling me? And this other American official was like, look, we're just finding out that this country is more complicated than we thought. I was like, yeah, finally. And there was a lot of that, I think, in 2013. There was a lot of that. Wait, hold on. We'd cast this as this big success story. What do you mean there's racist Burmese people who don't like Muslims? It's like, well, come on. And what I didn't like from that was this kind of dramatic overreaction. All Burmese are racist. Like, well, that's a racist thing to say. And I think there was, and you can still see this happening now. There was this tendency to kind of cast the Rohingya in a light that I think kind of cancelled out lots of other perspectives, and I think it's only right and just to address the immense suffering of the Rohingya population, statelessness. But I do think in a way that from human rights journalism and even a lot of political activism. You could see this in Washington as well, that somehow the Rohingya had replaced Dorsu in the Western imagination. And it was almost like, okay, we're tempering our perspectives on Burma now because of how you're treating that minority. And on the one hand, it's like, yes, it's a minority that's been living under apartheid conditions for many years and faces horrific structural and armed violence. But there are other people in the country too, and you've got to kind of balance that out with a deeper understanding. And yes, they're probably the community treated the worst in the country, but there's lots of other communities treated incredibly badly as well, from Karen State, and even to Sagaing, like, you know, people living in crushing poverty. So again, I think that there was a misstep on the part of the international community that would lurch to a kind of a major narrative instead of trying to have multiple narratives, and again, it was like, okay, we've come in 2012 and there's going to be elections in 2015. The idea that Western countries weren't involved in rigging that election to get Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD in power is ludicrous. Everyone was doing that. That had to be part of the script. And I'm not suggesting that there was corruption, but there was certainly a lot of, we need the NLD to win in order to unleash the really big aid that we're coming in, and we're going to shape Burma into our image, and there'll be a peace process and massive development, and everything. So yeah, it was fascinating to see that was that kind of master narrative that the West was pushing, and part of it was that Suu Kyi's now flawed because she's not speaking up for the Rohingya. So we've got to lift the Rohingya up to kind of shame her into kind of doing something better, which backfired quite dramatically in my view. But yeah, I think that the history of the transition, I know Mathieson has written a new book, which I haven't read yet, but I've heard it's fantastic. And I do think a retrospective on that decade is necessary if we're going to be moving forward, and for the West to admit its mistakes and try their best not to repeat them.
Right, absolutely. You've been talking about narratives. We've been talking about narratives a lot, and I want to go deeper into what a narrative is, as well as how it's played out in Burma. We talked about the narratives of the military, of the Sangha, of Aung San Suu Kyi that morphed into the Rohingya. And I want to go back to something you said earlier, which I had bookmarked, which was this reference how sometimes when in Washington, when there was a tendency to want to exaggerate certain things to fit a narrative, and then that became problematic in and of itself. And one of the things I was thinking as you said that is, yes, that's true. But it's also challenging to be able to tell incredibly nuanced and incomplete and confusing and complex information to someone in Washington. We know how Washington works, to be able to tell that to someone and have them grapple with a lack of answers, with a complexity that doesn't lend itself to easy solutions, with a contrasting histories that are not really matching or lining up. And so the way the mind works, and we know this with political campaigns across the world, is that you need to be able to fit something into a narrative. I think that Burma has been an example of even the reductionism that's happened in Burma has exceeded even what narratives elsewhere can be. I think narratives are by definition reductionist, and that's a necessary thing. We have to understand the world by telling ourselves a story about it, and then we have to learn facts which break that story, and we have to, if we're mature enough and strong enough and courageous enough and vulnerable enough, we have to be, because sometimes those narratives we tell are pleasant for ourselves, whether they're personal or national or ethnic or whatnot, we have to break those narratives to be able to probably form new ones. And so on this subject of the question of where we are with our narrative building in Burma, and one of the things that I've heard is how difficult it's been in this current environment to tell any kind of narrative at all, that no one has really, that I've seen, no one has really figured out to say what are the facts that we're constructing into a story to tell that narrative. And I think the initial, if there's one narrative I can say that came out, and this was soon after the coup, was this very unfortunate narrative that, well, this is a Buddhist country, now they're getting their Buddhist karma because these were the people that did this thing with the Rohingya. And now, and that was, and then there was, but there was also this sense, I had a number of people on the podcast that were in various American and Western circles, that there was just simply no one wanting to touch Burma. Just it was dead. It was gone, and that hasn't really changed.
No.
There has not been. We have not seen from any quarter of anyone that's marching in the streets for Gaza or raising money for Ukraine or talking about Syria or whatever else. Burma is just not. It's just barely even poked because there's so much fear and betrayal is the word I've been used. You talked about that in reference to Aung San Suu Kyi. Why would she betray us? As if she owed us something, but that itself stemmed from a flawed narrative of incomplete information of what
Absolutely.
we wanted to believe rather than what's there, which then we can go back and have a little bit of sympathy for because it's extremely complex and we need to fit something into a narrative. All narratives are by definition flawed.
I think that there's been attempts at creating narratives, but they were artificial and exaggerated, I think, in especially when it comes to some of the stuff around effective control and territorialization and what I call township determinism, that you know, the resistance has taken over this number of townships, therefore they're winning, and it's like that. You know, I can understand why some people might want to use that as an advocacy tool, but I just don't think it landed well, because I just don't think people had the attention span to really fully understand it, and then kind of. And I think that led into a narrative of imminent victory, which I thought was a very damaging narrative.
Yeah.
And that, especially when, you know, you can't be calling for imminent victory repeatedly, and, you know,
It's exhausting.
And being wrong, and eventually you become the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
And I think that's really been part of the narrative over the past few years. That people in Washington and Western capitals have been told we're beating the hell out of the Saka Asylum, we're about to win. It's like, okay, well, you said that a year ago, and where are we? And I think one disruption to that narrative really was Operation 1027. And I remember in the couple of weeks after that, spending more time chatting with Western journalists than I had probably in the past year. And there was this real sense of like, what is this? And at the time I was still processing. I'm still trying to process Operation 1027. There's just so much that we don't know, and I said, look, you've got to be careful in not further fueling a narrative of imminent victory, because that's just not fair. And also, there's immense suffering going on around the country, and there's some of that we're winning narrative I find incredibly distasteful, because it's dehumanizing. That you're sitting far away from Myanmar and you're not getting your village burnt down in Sagaing or being displaced in Arakan. And so I do think, you know, that I was saying to people, you've got to, if you're going to create this narrative of like, the resistance is winning. Yes, in that part of the country they are, but there's also parts of the country where they're winning, but they're being really quite circumspect about it. In Kuthule and in Kachin State, there's lots of gains, but those groups are just keeping it really quiet. And I do think that kind of, the resistance can win became a narrative after Operation 1027.
Right. Yeah.
And then, like a lot of narratives, as you said, you know, they're constructed, there was a lot of exaggeration. And I think that's where the narrative was lost. It's like you had this opportunity, I think, to kind of go, okay, the military is diminished, but it's not defeated. And so what does it take? And also, if your imminent narrative, if your imminent victory narrative holds together, what's the plan for the eventual collapse? The NUG doesn't have one. I think some of the EAOs do, but and that's where it was like, you should have anticipated that in speaking to Western policymakers, because that's what they're going to ask. What comes next? Who's going to take over?
Right.
It'll be it'll be the Garden of Earthly Delights. It'll be fantastic. It's like, no, like, you know, the end of most wars come with more wars.
Yeah.
And so I think that was a missed opportunity to kind of shape a narrative. And it's not just the National Unity Government that I think missed that opportunity, because they were part of that imminent victory narrative, which unfortunately I think has served to discredit them even further in Washington and other places. And a lot of the armed resistance don't do advocacy in Washington. I mean, the K3C kind of does in regional states, and they speak to Western diplomats. And so I think that was a missed opportunity. I think that there was some very good journalism around it. I think that it was good to see that kind of spike in interest. And now that, but you know, that was several months ago, and in Operation 1027 Part 2 over the past month, not much interest at all, even though they just took over Lasho.
Yeah.
And that to me is like, I'm telling journalist friends, this is unprecedented.
Yeah, yeah.
They took over the Northeast Command.
Yeah.
And, you know, having driven past that horrible command base, you know, hundreds of times, you know, I used to think, what would it take to actually get rid of them from here? And I just thought, there's no way that you're going to be able to do this. And bang, the Brotherhood's done it with their Mandalay PDF and BPLA and other allies. And you know, I'm really astonished that there hasn't been more international attention on this, because in many ways it's more stunning than the first phase.
I think so
of
too.
Operation 1027. But I do think one element, and you approach this head on, which is, you know, there is no interest in Burma. I think we really need to start inquiring why that is, and addressing it, because one narrative that was attempted, I think, was that this is a different Myanmar society since the coup. We've all seen the error of our ways, and we recognise the suffering of the Rohingya, and we're all one big happy family now. And there's unprecedented cooperation. I don't necessarily think that resonated in the international community, because there was very little proof. And I do think that there are a lot of younger people who are thinking about things in a more complicated, open-minded way, and are seeking more cooperative approaches to toppling the regime. But I do think there's a sedentary kind of perspective from a lot of older people, just like, no, we don't really need to change, we'll win eventually, and then we go back to being the NLD. And I think that's frustrating the development of a more positive international narrative, because it's just confusing to people. But I do think, looking at that, why is it that there is just no... And, you know, I've noticed over the past year or two that the first year or two after the coup, it was damn the United Nations and damn the international community, and we're being betrayed, and I do think it's a more positive spin that I hear from especially younger Myanmar friends who are like, well, we need to get over that and just realise that it's not coming. And also, when we win, we get to say we did it ourselves. And I find that an incredibly confident and positive approach. That instead of getting angry at the United Nations and the Americans for not coming to bail you out, realise they were never going to do it anyway. And you're on your own. And there's a liberation in that.
There is, yeah.
And there's enough recognition of some of the good humanitarian assistance that's being furnished by the West, and some other support. But that when it comes to the arm wing and the civil disobedience movement, they're on their own. And that to me is a pretty good narrative. Like, we don't need you. And we are self-sufficient. And that's the kind of thing that is going to get more people wanting to come and help you.
That's brilliant.
And you look at all the massive attention on the Karenni Interim Executive Council, which is, in my view, in danger of being smothered by too much foreign assistance and too many people wanting to come in and find a success story. But that resulted in them getting their act together, and then people kind of going, "Oh, that's a positive narrative. Look at that. It's people from different political factions, from different generations. It's older and younger. Their gender representation is fantastic, and it's their ideas that they're coming up with that is good." I think the narrative really should be one of self-sufficiency and success, and like, we don't necessarily need you.
Great.
And one, because it's true, and two, because it's a forceful kind of narrative that I think was sparked by Operation 1027 and its initial successes. So I think that's don't wait. I think if there's any lesson, don't wait for the West to come up with a narrative on you, which would probably be wrong. Come up with it yourself.
Right.
And propagate that. And I think that's where you generate interest from a very disinterested, depressed world, hurtling towards a probably quite destructive US presidential election, and bad news kind of everywhere else.
You talk about your interest and scene and the question that you've been asking so many of your Myanmar friends of what do you think comes next and what are those next stages, how is it going to be built, and the uncertainty around that, which no one really has the answers for. But the angle I want to ask you is about in this so-called transition period, you talked about the mess of the egos, the money, the infighting, the competition for this last frontier of Myanmar during those 2010s. And so and I also want to ask you this because you're so tapped into this international community and the way that they engage and also misunderstand in their engagement, their presence and interaction in Myanmar. And so looking at this international community and knowing them and knowing their background, knowing the kind of global context and what Myanmar represents in that, do you see a kind of repeat of if there does come stability, if the military is defeated, if there is this kind of messy period where we're trying to get things back on track, do you see a kind of repeat of these Western donors and agencies coming in, being territorial, doing just the same thing they did again and not learning anything, or do you see any different kind of engagement?
I remember calling on U Win Tain in the MP's village in Naypyidaw in 2016, and he gave me this sly look, and he said, Myanmar is the final frontier. The final frontier is a meat market. And he kind of meant it. He basically said, this is just, you guys are all weird. And he went on to be kind of, critical, but resigned to the fact that there were all these people coming in, and the short answer would have to be, yes, I don't think the international community knows any other way of doing it than messy, competitive, wasteful, arrogant, and stupid. It's just the way that they do things. I think the only difference would be that there'd be more open acknowledgement that there were lots of mistakes made during that period. But whether they learn from those mistakes, I'm afraid I don't have much hope. Because you can see a lot of the mistakes, speaking to various friends about this over the past year, and it's like, that period of the peace process when it's clear that things weren't going very well, but no one wanted to rock the boat, or, whatever other cliche comes out, there'll be a spoiler. That was the one thing I heard quite a lot of. And I can see the same thing. There's a lot of really stupid decisions that donors are making that are wasteful of money. And
you're seeing now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Millions of dollars is going to waste.
Is there examples you can give?
The Joint Peace Fund, which has been a nemesis of mine for quite some time, I just think is an abomination that shouldn't exist. It's a gangster cabal of several donors who, there is no peace to actually support. And they've made some incredibly bad decisions about where some of that money goes. They've also made some good decisions and are supporting some really good Myanmar organisations. But that to me is when donors actually it's the sleep of reason of international development. And instead of, and I've said this in print, and I've said it to people involved, I've said it to diplomats, like, you should all just, the waste of millions of dollars in your self-importance is just abominable. You should be giving that money to the Myanmar media, which is, starving right now. Yeah. And give it to Myanmar organisations.
Yeah.
But, you're hiring a large number of foreigners who are having no effect. And I saw this during the peace process, and you're doing the same thing now. And yet, the capacity of foreigners, usually foreign white males, to exaggerate their importance. I wouldn't say exaggerate. I would say construct and make believe their own self-importance. And I find some people who are involved in the peace process still getting paid by the Joint Peace Fund that made mistakes that they should be in prison for, in my view. And that sounds, like very strong language, but, you look at that, I think there's a lot of people acting as if there is not a nationwide war going on inside the country.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
And the number of sleepwalkers and shapeshifters wandering around, that don't have any sense of urgency, or let alone compassion, let alone humanity. It's just like, no, this is a technical fix for something it's like, no, it's not a technical fix. So, I do think that there's some good things when it comes to international aid, and I think that there's been this like post-coup realignment of international assistance, especially cross-border assistance, that took some time to shape, and I think now is actually paying off, and there's more resources going cross-border that and going to communities, but that took some time, and again it was the evidence that led to it. But then there's the absurdity of the international development approach is they make stupid mistakes everywhere that they go, and are very reluctant to reform in ways that they should, and localization is a big thing. I think that they can do a lot more about that, but there's also a lot of international presence that just doesn't need to be here. There's a lot of what David Graeber called bullshit jobs, and there's a lot of waste, and I'm seeing increasingly a lot of Myanmar friends get resentful as resources become more scarce and competition becomes more fierce. The resentment towards foreigners who are just achieving, contributing nothing but getting paid a fortune is unforgivable. But unfortunately, I think that there's just so many snouts in the trough that reforming that to any positive degree is almost impossible.
Right, yeah. The last question I want to ask you comes back to this question of narrative, and the centerpiece of the Burma narrative for so long was Aung San Suu Kyi, and you yourself even said that in one of the early hooks and interests that you have was in her figure, what she represented, and how, and I think many of us fell in love with the image of this pure goodness in such fighting against such tyranny and for a better reality that we all hoped could have. And that was a love affair that many fell out of in painful and difficult ways. And so I wonder if you can describe in your own words, your early perception of Aung San Suu Kyi as a person, as the ideals that she represented. You mentioned meeting her and what you sensed from that interaction, and then as your interconnection and relationship with Myanmar as a country and a people strengthened, and as you did more of your own reading and travels and everything else, and Aung San Suu Kyi, as she was released from prison, started to be able to speak for herself instead of letting, I think when one can't speak for oneself, you can write whatever story you want. And I think that's what did happen for some time. When she didn't have her own voice, people gave her the voice that they wanted her to have. And so I imagine it was also a long process in coming out of that love affair as well for yourself. And if you can describe that disillusionment or journey you went on.
Yeah, I mean, in 1995, when she got out of house arrest, it was front page news around the world, and I think she caught the imagination of a lot of people. And she was really the figurehead of Burma for most of the world. And yeah, it was a real privilege to meet her in 1996, and we had a very wide-ranging chat. I mean, I was a young, just starting out graduate student from Australia, who had smuggled her first laptop in a few weeks before, so she wanted to meet to say thank you, which was very gracious. And we talked about, I asked her why it was the military had all of these nasty red and white billboards, crush all internal and external. Right. And I said, why are they in English? And she said something that I always thought was interesting. She goes, in their mind, they probably don't think it's important if it's not in English. And I said, but for ultra-nationalists and people who don't like the West. And she goes, yeah, but there are massive contradictions. And then, there were things that happened over those years. She was released again in 2002. Then the military tried to murder her in Dep Ayen in 2003. I was still very supportive partly because of her as a figurehead, but also because the scenes of her traveling around in 2012 when she went on these tours and the crowds that came out, I was like, this is vindication that she is wildly popular, and she does represent this movement to stare down the military, and I still do think that was something really quite remarkable during those years, and yet I could also see that there was, I think it was taking a toll. I think whenever she came out and she kind of spoke, she was still very determined, but there was a steeliness, I think, that started developing. And then with the big, transition, I thought she made some really quite deplorable missteps. I thought becoming the head of the investigative commission over the Let Padang, I remember seeing the footage of the community from Let Padang yelling at her.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, the crown has certainly slipped.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a political miscalculation. And then we when the Human Rights Watch board and the executive director at the time, Ken Roth, travelled to Naypyidaw, we had an hour with U Thein Sein, and we met other ministers, including the Deputy Minister of Defence and many others. But when we went to Parliament to see the head of the Rule of Law Committee, she just didn't want to meet us.
Yeah.
And that to me was a level of churlishness, like, not expecting a pat on the back, but Human Rights Watch and Amnesty had been doing a lot of work for lots of different people in the country, and taking half an hour out of your busy schedule, just basically to acknowledge it. And some of her Western advisors actually were horrified and said to me, we're really sorry that we just couldn't convince her.
Yeah.
And that's when I was like, okay, this is done. She's not going to be a friend to human rights promotion. And then I went to the press conference in 2015 at the compound in Tekadolan, and she just handled it all wrong. And I'd come to this conclusion before, but it really kind of hammered it home. It's like, look, it's not just that you're a disappointment ethically, you're just not a very good politician. And so you had to kind of balance that realization with the reality that she was also incredibly popular, and that 2015 and also in 2020 in those elections, they were a vote as much for her as they were against the military. And I think that was the powerful combination, that she was like, yeah, it's not just me you're voting for, you're voting to keep this this mafia and khaki out of the country's political affairs. But I do think there's some things that she did that probably need to be better understood. I think the way she dealt with the Marbatha was either very skillfully done or a bit of good fortune. I'm not sure, but I think that was quite effective. And then other things she did that were absolutely disastrous. And I think her reputation's always going to be mixed up, I think, for two reasons. One, going to The Hague was it for a lot of people. And then two, messing up the negotiations with the military ahead of the coup, I think was, that's what I hear from a lot of people. That everything else she might have done before that was one of her greatest failings. And I think it's, I don't know, I think the international community's just lost so much interest in her, and there's no recovery. I think, I mean, if she was released, there's definitely going to be a lot of interest, but it's going to be tempered with a lot of ill feeling, I think, towards her. And I think that's quite tragic, because her and 20,000 other people do not deserve to be in prison. And I think sometimes Western criticism of her misses that point, that they've all been unfairly incarcerated under completely bogus charges. And so, unfortunately, she's been an agent of tarnishing her own legacy. I think, and that's really sad for her and for the country. But I also think trying to think positively about all of these realities is that, you know, I hate it, and again, it's one of these Western narratives. Like, so who's the next Aung San Suu Kyi? It's like, you don't want the next Aung San Suu Kyi. You want Athinza Shonleye. You want Boteza. You know, you want new people that are you want Maui from the KNDF. You want people doing amazing stuff in civil society and in lots of different fields to be leaders. I mean, Myanmar needs multiple leaders. They don't need one figurehead. That's been proven to just not work. And I think if there's any lesson that positive lesson to learn from Dorsu is, you know, basically to have younger, more open-minded and diverse leadership that is befitting of the country, I think, and not necessarily this wintry, austere kind of person who kind of. I thought that Dorsu kind of looked down her nose, I think, at a lot of people, and some of her speeches. It's really like, oh yeah, that's just a little bit, tone deaf, I would say. But, I don't think she should be in prison, but I also think there should be a more realistic assessment of her legacy. And there's a lot of unfairness. I actually thought that Wendy Law Yone's book on Aung San Suu Kyi was absolutely fantastic. And I think captured so much depth, even though it's a very short book. And Wendy just put together the best kind of vignettes and crafted it in such a way that you really kind of got to the heart of Dorsu's contradictions. And I think it's a quietly powerful book that everyone should read. And I think that not these, you know, huge, big kind of biographies that, you know, wrapped up in everything. I think Wendy really captured her. And that would be the book I recommend to anyone to read to try and understand Aung San Suu Kyi.
So you talked a bit about her legacy and describing the ups and downs and trajectory of that. I'm also wondering about your own personal sentiment and emotions, because this was someone that you personally invested a lot of hope in and that drew you into the struggle and conflict. So just from an emotional standpoint, it as you started to parse the tea leaves and realize that things were not the way you thought they were originally, I wonder what effect that had on you, given the hope that you had placed on her and the hope that she had for the country as well.
I think you got to temper disappointment with. Remember people asking me this, like, you know, are you disappointed? I was like, yeah, I am, but it's not about me. It's about 54 million people in the country. And, you know, sometimes as foreigners, it's all about. I think Burma excites so much emotion in lots of foreigners who feel probably a lot stronger about it than they really need to at times. And it's and I feel that way about Aung San Suu Kyi. It's not about me or my emotions. I can be disappointed, but it's really what's best for the country moving forward. And I would much rather sit down and listen to Burmese friends what they think about Aung San Suu Kyi, because I think that there's a lot more sophistication and varied emotions than you know, a foreigner who was complicit in projecting our kind of values onto her without asking her permission first. And so yeah, I mean, I think that whenever that kind of disappointment comes in, you've got to avert your disappointment to look for something positive and look at who's doing really good work, and you find that there's a lot of people doing great work. So yeah, I don't try and dwell on it, because it's there's a lot of really positive things going on, and I think that's where people's energy should be directed, not into kind of any kind of bitter recriminations of Amesu disappointing you. I just think don't wallow in that and move forward, and try and learn some practical lessons about various approaches to very difficult circumstances. And also how to deal with the West, because she, you know, I think, again, Ambassador Marcial's book, I think, is fantastic for that period. Also, Erin Murphy's fantastic book, Burmese Haze, I think does a real service to kind of uncovering how Dorsu was negotiating with the Americans and sanctions and things. And I would highly recommend both those books to have that understanding and a better kind of insight into how she wasn't necessarily the most skillful of negotiators.
Yeah.
And but also how American kind of interests were colliding with her relative indecision and competing American interests. It's so yeah, I still think up until I think that there's got to be a more critical kind of in-depth understanding of how the West constructed her. It's always about kind of her.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think we should turn the gaze on ourselves and kind of see. I'm sure you and listeners to the podcast have seen these horrible videos that came out like 15 or so years ago that I think it was US Campaign for Burma that did it. It was all these celebrities. And it was like Woody Harrelson not coming out of his trailer until Burma was free, and Jennifer Aniston was like, okay, well, let's get that done. And Tila Tequila is like a teacher who's like doing like a strip tease over who General Tanch wrote. I mean, they were really, really terrible. And Jim Carrey does one and can't pronounce Aung San Suu Kyi very well. And it was just that. And then there was this other thing that and I've been trying to write something on this for quite some time about the rise and fall of, I call it the rise and fall of Studio 54. That, so many people in the West saw Suu Kyi and 54 Tekoto land is like this redoubt of resistance. And yet a lot of it was just projection. And some of it kind of creepy, like at the U2 concert when everyone had the Dorsu mask. I find there was a lot of Western activism on Suu Kyi that was really quite ridiculous and unsettling. And having absolutely no idea, having never been to the country and having absolutely no idea what it was about, or any kind of thought about what positive impact all of that activism was going to have, and the result was very little. So I do think it's important that we reflect on our own perceptions of and our own failures, and try to learn from that, and maybe some more positive narratives can emerge as a result.
Well, I thank you so much for your time today and for talking on so many topics. It's been great to go into this kind of depth and detail.
I think we could be talking about this for hours and hours. There's just so much to talk about. But the one thing I would say is that even with all of the darkness in Burma right now and the horrors of the military, I do think that we've got to be positive about the future, and that good things will come of it, and recognize that there's so many people doing incredibly brave and important things, and there's a spirit, I think, that in many respects you don't need to worry about an international narrative and international support if you understand that there is all of this very positive responses to what's going on, and find a way as foreigners to in necessarily small ways just to support that, and that's what I think a lot of people are trying to do. So yeah.
As inspiring as today's guest was, I know from experience that when you're listening from so far away, there can also be a certain kind of helplessness in hearing about the people's dire struggles. Thankfully, our nonprofit offers a reliable way for interested listeners to provide financial assistance to those local communities who need it most. Your donations will be sent to support urgent humanitarian missions, as well as those vulnerable peoples being impacted by the military coup. By taking an active role in supporting the movement, you can help ensure that people like today's speaker have even a few more resources to draw on and can manage just another week in continuing their efforts. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.